the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe episode 43. Standing on the edge, welcome back to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe, the space where we step into the questions that haunt the margins and explore what it means to live at the limits of being human. In this arc, edge states, thresholds, extremes, and the human limit, we've already explored the body's thresholds in pleasure and pain, and the altered realities we touch through dreams, trance, and psychedelics. Now we turn toward the edge itself. This episode is about standing in that place where comfort ends and intensity begins, where identity feels less like something solid and more like something dissolving, where some find ecstasy, some find collapse, and most of us find both. The edge has always fascinated humanity, whether it's climbers on a mountain face, monks in silence, or artists pushing form until it breaks. At the threshold, something happens. We see who we are, and we see who we might become. We'll explore the psychology of limits, the lure and danger of extremity, and the paradox that edges both break us and make us. Because standing on the edge isn't just about survival, it's about transformation. So let's begin. Standing on the edge. Where comfort ends, every human life has its thresholds. The edges where what is familiar dissolves into something uncharted. These edges appear in the body, in the mind, in relationships, and in the spaces where society presses against us. To stand on the edge is to feel both the pull of safety and the lure of possibility. It is to know that beyond this step, something will change, maybe forever. Edges are uncomfortable, sometimes terrifying, yet they are also where aliveness is sharpest. Few remember the weeks they spent in comfort, but everyone remembers the moments where they stood on a precipice, literal or metaphorical, and felt everything sharpen into clarity. That is the paradox of the edge. It is where identity loosens, fear rises, and transformation whispers. The threshold of extremes. This part explores what it means to stand on thresholds, not crossing them just yet, but pausing in that liminal place where comfort ends and intensity begins. Themes and attributes edges can be physical, emotional, spiritual, or social, yet their structure is remarkably similar. They always demand choice, they always carry risk, and they always reveal something hidden about who we are. Themes, liminality. Edges mark the in-between, no longer who we were, not yet who we are becoming. Risk and uncertainty. To stand on the edge is to face the unknown, with no guarantee of safety or reward. Identity dissolution. Edges destabilize self-concepts. Old definitions blur and new ones have not yet formed. Fear and curiosity. The edge provokes both dread and wonder, the urge to retreat and the call to explore. Transformation. Every edge, once crossed, reshapes us, but even standing at it without moving can deepen awareness. Attributes of edge states. Intensity. Emotions amplify, time slows, sensations heighten, and choices feel heavier. Isolation. Standing on the edge often feels lonely, as if no one else can quite see what you see. Contradiction. Safety and danger, life and death, self and other, all blur together. Sacredness. Many cultures treat thresholds as holy places, doorways where humans meet the divine. Fragility. The edge is fragile, one step forward or back changes everything. These themes and attributes don't just describe the extraordinary moments of cliff edges or psychedelic peaks. They describe the quieter edges too, leaving home, breaking silence, daring to love, or deciding to walk away. Personal reflection. For me, one of the most formative edges came in my late teens, between 16 and 19. At 16, I poured myself into study. I became something of a hermit, working weekends, reading science and engineering for hours, fascinated by learning. My friends drifted toward nightclubs, alcohol, and the noise of adolescence. I went with them sometimes, but more often I stayed away, uncomfortable in places where I couldn't hear my voice. I remember the guilt of saying no, the subtle disappointment in a friend's eyes when I chose books over bars. One evening, a friend came to wish me well before university, and though we never argued, the distance grew. Our contact faded. That was an edge, the quiet kind. Standing at it meant recognizing that my path was diverging, and that choosing myself meant letting go of belonging as I had known it. Edges are not always dramatic cliffs or crises. Sometimes they are the slow burn of difference, the ache of no longer fitting where you once did. For me, that edge carried both pride in my dedication and a hollow loneliness, the sense of being on the threshold of adulthood, yet unsure if I wanted to cross it the way others expected me to. Psychological insight edges have fascinated psychology because they are points of maximum tension. Victor Turner, the anthropologist, coined the term liminality to describe transitional states in rites of passage. In the liminal phase, the old identity is stripped away, but the new has not yet solidified, a place of danger but also possibility. Standing at the edge is essentially a liminal moment. Existential psychology adds another layer. Thinkers like Rollo May argued that confrontation with the unknown is what makes us truly alive. Anxiety at thresholds is not pathology, but evidence that something meaningful is at stake. Similarly, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's work on flow states suggests that standing at the boundary of our abilities, the very edge of competence and challenge, is where growth and deep engagement happen. But edges can also fracture. Research into identity transitions shows that without support, edges can spiral into confusion, alienation, or breakdown. The same precipice that offers growth can also invite collapse. This duality explains why thresholds have always been treated with ritual caution. Societies knew the edge was sacred and dangerous, not something to be taken lightly. Embodiment prompt or practice this week: notice your edges. Choose one situation where you feel yourself at a threshold. Maybe it's a decision you've been postponing, a conversation you fear, or an opportunity that excites and unnerves you. Pause at the edge. Instead of rushing forward or retreating, linger. Breathe. Feel the sensations in your body. Name the contradiction. What pulls you back? What pulls you forward? Write them down as two voices. Hold both. Practice standing in the discomfort without resolving it. Notice that you don't break, you expand. This practice builds tolerance for liminality. It teaches that standing at the edge, without collapsing into action or avoidance, is itself a kind of wisdom. Integration moment. Standing on the edge is not about proving courage or leaping recklessly. It is about awareness, recognizing that edges are where life grows sharp and real. They strip away illusion and force us to face ourselves. Sometimes the edge is a cliff we must climb. Sometimes it is a doorway we simply notice. But always it is an invitation. By integrating our experiences of edges, from the dramatic to the quiet, we begin to see thresholds not as places of failure or fear, but as places of awakening. They show us where we have outgrown what is safe, and where we are called towards something greater. Seed to plant next time you find yourself at an edge, big or small. Whisper to yourself. This is the place of becoming. The seed is to honor the edge, not rush past it. To stand there consciously is already a transformation. The body on the brink edges aren't just metaphors, they live in flesh and bone. To push the body toward its limit is to discover where endurance ends and transformation begins. From athletes gasping at the last mile, to fasting monks on the edge of starvation, to initiates enduring tattoo rituals, the body has always been the first threshold humans test. When the body meets its limit, but the edge of the body is double-edged. On one side lies ecstasy, the endorphin high, the runner's flow, the transcendence of ritual pain. On the other side lies collapse, injury, or even death. To live at the body's edge is to gamble with mortality, testing how far intensity can stretch before it breaks. The body doesn't lie. It tells us when we are near the edge, whether through exhaustion, hunger, tremor, or elation. To listen to these signals, and sometimes to override them, is to enter into dialogue with our most primal threshold. Themes and attributes: themes, endurance and transcendence. Physical edges bring altered states. Pain blurring into ecstasy, hunger into clarity, exhaustion into euphoria. Mortality awareness. Every physical threshold reminds us that the body is finite, fragile, and temporary. Discipline versus recklessness. Cultures distinguish between ritualized pushing of limits, martial arts, pilgrimage, fasting, and reckless endangerment, stunts, self-harm. Both flirt with the edge, but one carries intention. Embodiment and disconnection. Standing at the body's edge can heighten awareness or, paradoxically, numb us. Initiation. Many societies use physical ordeal to mark transformation. The edge becomes a rite of passage. Attributes of bodily edge states: intensity, every nerve alive, sensations magnified beyond measure, vulnerability, stripped of defenses, the body reveals its fragility, clarity or dissociation, some find focus at the brink, others drift into detachment. Altered chemistry, endorphins, adrenaline, dopamine shift perception, blurring the line between pain and pleasure, threshold awareness, a visceral sense that one step more could change everything. Personal reflection, looking back, I can trace moments where my body was the edge I stood on. At 16, I buried myself in study, hours of engineering assignments finished almost as soon as they were given, weekends spent working jobs, nights sunk into textbooks. At first, it felt like a strength, a dedication that set me apart, a private victory. But the body always keeps the score. I became a hermit, socially thinner, tired even when I slept, guilty for turning down invitations. When I did step into new thresholds, the body offered another kind of lesson. Hunger sharpened my focus, but also left me irritable. Long runs emptied my head, but sometimes tipped me into exhaustion. The edge was never stable. One day it gave me discipline, the next it reminded me of fragility. What I learned was this: the body isn't just a vessel we push to serve the mind. It is the first gatekeeper of threshold experience, the terrain where our ambition collides with our limits. Psychological insight. The body at its edge reveals the strange marriage between biology, psychology, and meaning. Endurance studies suggest that fatigue is not purely physical, but largely neurological. Researchers like Samuel Marcora argue the brain operates a kind of central governor, pulling the brakes long before the body's true limit to prevent collapse. That moment when you think you can't go on, whether running, fasting, or holding your breath, is often the mind's attempt to preserve safety, not an accurate reading of failure. This means the edge is both real and illusory, a negotiation between what the body can endure and what the mind permits. Anthropologists remind us that cultures have long ritualized this negotiation. Victor Turner observed how rites of passage often involved ordeal, fasting, scarification, and endurance trials. The point was not cruelty but transformation. Pain and hunger stripped away the ordinary self, forcing initiates to encounter something raw and unmediated. At the threshold, identity dissolved and a new one emerged. Neuroscience deepens the picture. At the brink, the chemistry of the brain shifts. Endorphins flood in to numb pain, dopamine spikes to drive persistence, and adrenaline primes survival. These are not abstract processes, but deeply felt states. The runner's high, the faster's clarity, the climber's sharpened awareness on the cliff face. The edge of the body is also the edge of the mind, but there is danger too. Trauma research shows what happens when thresholds are overwhelmed, push the body past capacity, and instead of transcendence, the nervous system may retreat into dissociation. Numbness replaces clarity, collapse replaces initiation. The same edge that produces growth in one context can carve wounds in another. For me, this makes bodily edges less about bravado and more about dialogue. Every limit tested is a conversation. How much can I hold? What meaning do I assign to this strain? Am I pushing for growth or fleeing from something else? The insight is not that we must always push through. It is that the edge, felt in hunger pangs, trembling muscles, burning lungs, is a mirror. It reveals both our resilience and our fragility, showing us where discipline transforms and where recklessness destroys. Embodiment prompt or practice. Choose a safe way to approach a bodily edge this week. It doesn't need to be extreme, just enough to feel intensity rise. Microfast. Skip one meal and observe how hunger shifts your mood and focus. Breath edge. Hold the breath a few seconds past comfort. Notice the wave of resistance, the urge to release. Endurance edge. Extend a walk, run, or cycle beyond your usual point of ease. Listen to your body's shifting signals. The goal is awareness, not conquest. To stand at the edge long enough to hear what the body is saying. Integration moment. The body's thresholds are reminders that we are mortal, yet more resilient than we often believe. They call us into humility and also into awe. By listening to bodily edges, we learn not only when to push, but when to pause. Integration means living with the body as partner, not enemy, recognizing that every tremor, ache, or surge of adrenaline is a message. Seed to plant this week when your body whispers enough, pause and respond. I hear you. The edge is not the end, but a teacher. The seed is respect. To honor thresholds, not as walls to be smashed, but as doorways that open when entered with intention. Edges of the mind and identity. The body gives us one kind of edge, but the mind offers another, subtler, stranger, often more dangerous. To live at the edge of thought is to walk the line where imagination blurs into delusion, where identity dissolves, and where intensity pushes the psyche into uncharted territory, when the self starts to fray. This edge doesn't announce itself with muscle tremors or pounding lungs. It whispers. It shows up as late night thoughts looping like broken records, or as moments where you no longer know if you're the one steering your life or just playing a part. It is the feeling of standing at the threshold of your mind, peering over into the unknown. Some chase this edge through philosophy, psychedelics, or meditation. Others stumble into it through trauma, grief, or crisis. However it comes, the edge of the mind is not easily forgotten because it shakes the very ground of who we believe ourselves to be. Themes identity dissolution, the breakdown of the stable I, glimpsed in mysticism, madness, or even deep flow states. Thresholds of sanity, where creativity and instability overlap, where passion tips into obsession. Isolation and belonging. Edges of the mind often emerge in periods of withdrawal when we drift from the herd. Resilience versus collapse. Psychological thresholds can either catalyze growth or fracture identity. Meaning making. Edges force us to ask, who am I when my old story no longer holds? Attributes of psychological edge states disorientation. The ground of meaning feels unstable. Heightened intensity. Thoughts, emotions, or perceptions feel magnified. Fluid identity, the sense of self shifts, dissolves, reforms. Vulnerability, openness to insight, but also to breakdown. Ambiguity, hard to tell whether what's happening is revelation or unraveling. Personal reflection. When I was 16, my edge wasn't physical, it was mental. I buried myself in study, hours at my desk, engineering textbooks scattered like puzzle pieces I was desperate to solve. At first, it felt exhilarating, even empowering. But slowly, without noticing, I slid into isolation. Friends drifted toward clubs, noise, and neon nights. I drifted into silence. When I did go out, I often felt the odd one out, standing in a nightclub, unable to hear myself speak, wondering why everyone else seemed to belong while I felt split from the inside. My friends made new connections. I smiled, joined in, but beneath it all, I felt like I was playing at being present while secretly watching from the outside. That was my threshold, the creeping recognition that my identity no longer aligned with the world around me. At times, guilt gnawed at me. I turned down invitations. I let connections fray. One friend stopped by before university to wish me well, disappointed I wouldn't be around. That moment lingered. It wasn't just about friendship. It was about the realization that I was stepping into a threshold alone, withdrawing into study and thought, while others moved into shared experiences. Edges of the mind are not always dramatic. Sometimes they arrive quietly, as the slow erosion of belonging, the subtle collapse of a shared language. Psychological insight standing at the edge of identity has fascinated psychology for over a century. William James, one of the earliest explorers of consciousness, noted how mystical experiences often carry a sense of ego dissolution, the melting of the boundary between self and world. He argued these states could be both terrifying and profoundly meaningful, depending on how the mind integrated them. Carl Jung went further, describing what he called individuation, the process of dissolving and reforming the self in dialogue with the unconscious. For Jung, the edge wasn't pathology but necessity. The old identity must crack for the deeper self to emerge. Yet he warned of inflation, moments where people mistake dissolution for enlightenment, or are overwhelmed by the archetypes that flood in when the ego weakens. Modern psychology frames these edges through terms like identity crisis, Erik Erikson, or liminality, Victor Turner. An identity crisis isn't simply confusion, it's a threshold. Old roles break down, student, child, partner, but new roles aren't yet formed. In that gap, the self feels unstable. Turner called this liminality a betwixt and between state, fertile but unsettling. Neuroscience adds another layer. Studies of meditation, psychedelics, and flow states show how the brain's default mode network, the part linked with self referential thought, can quiet down, producing feelings of unity or ego dissolution. But similar disruptions can also appear in psychosis or trauma, where the loss of stable identity feels more like drowning than awakening. This is the paradox of the mind's edge. The same doorway can open to creativity, mystical union, or psychological collapse. Which path unfolds often depends not just on the state itself, but on the container, ritual, and community, meaning that surround it. For me, those years of withdrawal taught me that living at the mind's threshold can be both a gift and a wound. In isolation, I discovered depth, but I also discovered loneliness. The edge was not cleanly transcendent, it was messy, ambiguous, alive. Embodiment prompt or practice explore a threshold of identity safely. Mirror dialogue. Stand before a mirror and ask out loud, who am I when no one else is watching? Listen without rushing to answer. Role suspension. For one day, release one role you usually inhabit: student, worker, parent. Notice what fills the space when the label is set down. Threshold walk. Take a walk alone at night or dawn, liminal hours, and reflect on who you are when the world around you is in transition. Integration moment. The edges of the mind are not detours from identity, they are part of how identity evolves. Each time the self feels unstable, it is an invitation to loosen rigid roles and discover new possibilities. Integration means learning to honor thresholds not as signs of failure, but as stages of transformation. Seed to planks time you feel on the edge, mentally restless, unmoored, uncertain, pause and ask, what old story is dissolving? What new story is waiting to emerge? The seed is patience. Edges of the mind are not walls, they are birth canals. Standing with the unknown living without a map edges always point toward what cannot be fully known. Whether it's death, the future, or the mystery of who we are becoming, thresholds remind us that certainty is a story we tell ourselves, and one that can unravel in an instant. To stand with the unknown is to live without a map. It is to let go of control long enough to admit that life is not fully predictable, that not every chapter can be scripted. This can feel terrifying, but it can also be liberating. For if we are not bound by what we already know, then we are free to encounter what we could never have imagined. The unknown is not empty, it is charged. It holds possibility and danger, promise and loss. To stand at its edge is to realize that our task is not to conquer it, but to learn how to stand there without collapsing. Themes and attributes themes uncertainty as reality. Control is always partial, life is always unpredictable. The courage of not knowing. Strength comes from remaining open, not from premature answers. Surrender versus resistance. We either soften into mystery or exhaust ourselves fighting it. The creative void, the unknown, is where art, innovation, and new stories are born. Mortality and mystery. Death as the ultimate unknown, shaping how we live. Attributes of encountering the unknown suspension. Time feels paused, decisions deferred. Tension, fear, and excitement interwoven. Silence, words fail, certainty evaporates. Possibility, when the old ends, the new may begin. Humility, standing before something larger than the self. 3. Personal reflection. When I left for university, I thought I had my future mapped. Study hard, become an engineer, build a stable life. Yet within the first year, the map began to blur. The certainty I carried from endless study hours at 16, where I thought discipline and knowledge could protect me from the unknown, dissolved into late nights of doubt, questions, and a subtle sense that I was standing on ground less solid than I had imagined. The unknown met me not in one dramatic collapse, but in 1,000 small ways. In the silence of a dorm room after friends had gone out. In the sense that the more I learned, the less I understood. In the sharp loneliness of realizing I had chosen a path that both defined me and separated me. There were times I resisted, doubling down on study, filling every gap with work so I wouldn't have to feel the uncertainty. But there were also moments where I surrendered, late night walks across campus, feeling the cool air press against my skin and allowing myself to admit I don't know. I don't know what's next. I don't know who I will become. Looking back, those moments of surrender were the ones that carried me forward. The unknown wasn't an enemy. It was the space in which I learned to breathe without a script. Psychological insight psychology often frames the unknown as anxiety. Uncertainty activates the amygdala, heightening vigilance and flooding the body with stress hormones. For evolutionary reasons, this makes sense. Uncertainty may have meant predators or famine. But in modern life, the unknown more often shows up as transition, loss of a job, end of a relationship, questions of identity. Erik Erikson's model of psychosocial development highlights how each stage of life confronts us with an unknown. Adolescence asks, "Who am I?" Early adulthood, "How do I connect?" Later adulthood, "What legacy will I leave?" At each threshold, certainty breaks and must be remade. Viktor Frankl, in Man's Search for Meaning, described the unknown as the crucible for meaning. He argued that we cannot control what happens, but we can choose our response, and that choice is where freedom is born. Existential psychologists like Rollo May and Irvin Yalom emphasize that standing with the unknown, especially death, is not pathology but part of being human. Yalom wrote, "Though the physicality of death destroys us, the idea of death may save us. By confronting the unknown of mortality, we are jolted into living more fully." What neuroscience adds is that uncertainty isn't always paralyzing. Dopamine pathways light up in unpredictable situations, suggesting that novelty and uncertainty also fuel curiosity, risk-taking, and creativity. The unknown frightens us, but it also propels us into discovery. This is the paradox. The unknown is both fear and freedom. To collapse into fear is to shrink life. To stand in it with humility is to expand. Embodiment prompt or practice standing with the unknown in small, safe ways. Pause before answering. Next time someone asks you something personal, try saying, "I don't know." Notice what it feels like to resist the reflex for certainty. Edge experiment. Step into an unfamiliar space, a new class, a solitary walk in an unknown place, or a book outside your usual taste. Experience the unknown not as danger, but as possibility. Breath practice. When anxiety rises, breathe in for 4 counts, hold for 4, exhale for 6. This mimics surrender to the unknown, holding without rushing to control. Integration moment. Standing with the unknown is not about becoming fearless. It is about becoming willing. The threshold of uncertainty is the space where we discover who we are when the map ends. Integration begins when we stop treating the unknown as a problem to be solved and start treating it as a presence to be met. The unknown is where life renews itself, not in what we already know, but in what waits beyond. Seed to plant tonight. Instead of demanding answers, ask yourself, what am I willing to not know yet? The seed is trust. Trust that the unknown is not empty, but alive with possibility. Keep standing at the edges are not accidents. They are invitations. Every time life presses us to the boundary of what we know, we are given a choice: retreat into comfort, or stay long enough to let the threshold change us. Standing on the edge is never easy. It asks us to strip away certainty, to feel intensity without flinching, to risk losing the identity we thought defined us. But in doing so, it also reveals something rare, the raw aliveness that only comes when we stop hiding from the unknown. The truth is, thresholds are everywhere. They appear in our bodies, in our relationships, in the decisions we avoid, in the silences we carry. We don't have to go chasing cliffs or ordeals. Life itself will deliver us to the edge. What matters is whether we recognize the moment and dare to stay present. Because the edge is not just where things end, it's also where things begin. You've been listening to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. Until next time, stay human, stay awake, and let the edge give you a choice. James Miller. If you found value in today's episode, you may also be interested in my broader project, The Inversiverse, a series exploring the hidden architecture of perception, identity control, and consciousness. Across 20 episodes, The Inversiverse dissects indoctrination, language, media manipulation, dark psychology, belief systems, and the evolution of self in the digital age. You can find all episodes of The Inversiverse on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, and Substack by searching this place called Earth. These ideas aren't shared to convince you, but to invite you to think, feel, and perceive more consciously in a world designed to keep you distracted. Overview of the Inversiverse, a journey through the mirrors of mind, culture, and control. Episodes 1 to 3 introduce foundational ideas around indoctrination, perception, and manipulation. Episode 4 explores how language, symbols, and cultural norms are used to shape thought. Episode 5 investigates control systems, media narratives, and the illusion of choice. Episodes 6 to 7 dives into collective belief structures and the psychology of mass behavior. Episode 8 focuses on marketing, control theory, game theory, and critical thinking. Episode 9 Covers love, relationships, human mating, gender dynamics, and red-blue pill ideologies. Episode 10 unpacks dark psychology, the occult, Satanism, and the dark triad personality types. Episode 11 The Simulated Self examines identity, ego, and the rise of post-human consciousness. Episode 12 The Spell of the Mind inquires into language, illusion, and physiology of thought. Episode 13 Conscious Seduction journeys through persuasion, propaganda, and the unseen forces of the mind. Episode 14 The Myth of Sanity sheds light on madness, genius, and the edge of perception. Episode 15 The Algorithmic Mind probes influence, identity, and invisible architects. Episode 16 The Noise of Knowing reveals overload, obsession, and the age of infinite information. Episode 17 Belief Machines delves further into language, desire, and the engine of reality. Episode 18 Submerged Signals examines how the unseen shapes the self. Episode 19 The Alchemy Within Traces, Food, Frequency, and the Forgotten Intelligence of the Body. Episode 20 Encoded Flesh scrutinizes and opens up to the forgotten language of the body, DNA, and biological consciousness.